Our symposium continues from where we left off with the third session. Since the third session primarily consists of international guests, the presentation will be in English. First, I would like to introduce our session chair, Associate Professor Hasan Karatas from Istanbul Technical University. Following him with his very own presentation, Meliha Teparic from Sarajevo University and Rosana Ratkovc from University North from Croatia will deliver their presentations. Immediately after them, Grenier from Florida International University will give his presentation titled The Muhammediyye and Envaru'l-A, located in early Ottoman religious literature between Medrese, Tekke and Frontier. Immediately after him, we have Emin Lelic from Salisbury University with his talk titled Self-Knowledge Through Self-physiognomation.
Today we have a great lineup of speakers, and I will not take too much of your time and start with my short presentation and then move on with our wonderful speakers here. So my presentation will be about Kelkit Valley between Anatolia, particular part of Anatolia, which is called the Rum region, currently including the cities of Sivas, Tokat, Amasya, Çorum, and later on Trabzon and Bayburt, and how this region in the 15th century was constantly receiving immigrants from this, again, another sub-region in modern-day Azerbaijan, that is Shirvan. The connection between these two regions was very curious for me when I was working on my dissertation, which is about Amasya. I see these scholars arriving from Shirvan, not just scholars, but also poets, artists arriving from Shirvan, and usually their first stop is Amasya. But what is between these two regions and how these two regions are connected, or why are they connected, is a question I had in mind. So my talk will be about three themes. The first one will be the role of Kelkit Valley in the transmission of the Halvetiyye Sufi order. I'm sure most of us would agree that Halvetiyye Sufi order is one of the most critical, very influential Sufi orders of the Ottoman Empire. And the second one is based on my findings. I will also hope to offer a more nuanced understanding of the historical geography and topography of Anatolia, or the larger Western Asia, because Halvetiyye's migration to the west was actually part of a larger historical phenomenon, which we call the expansion of the Persianate world to the west, which we now call it the Ottoman Empire. And thirdly, I will bring up the question of agency, historical agency, and how space can be a historical agent like people, or how we can actually look at non-humans as historical agents, or can we look at them as historical regions. Kelkit Valley, which I also have a personal connection because quite a significant chunk of my family ancestors come from Gümüşhane, Tokat, Zile, and Amasya. Kelkit Valley is basically the water basin around the Kelkit River, or the Lycus River, as you can see from this picture. It's actually about a 180 kilometer long valley surrounded by many inhabitations, small and large, and because of the inclination of the topography, we find more lands that can be irrigated, more alluvial accumulation towards the west. So the cities, towns towards the west, like Erbaa, Niksar, are more populated compared to ones, little in the higher areas in the east. But overall, this region was a very important passage point, an important route connecting Anatolia to the east, to Persian world, to Tabriz through Erzurum, to Tabriz, a major city of Iran, as well as Şamaxı, which is the capital of Shirvan region. And Shirvan region, in this map, you can find the Shirvan region, on the right side of this picture. Today, where you can see modern-day Azerbaijan, Shirvan Shahs are an old dynasty ruling this region, and in this region we find, among many, cultural and political developments, we also find the breeding of the formation of the Halvetiye Sufi order. So this region was, let me, if I can move or I'll just go ahead and show you on the map here. It is connected to Amasya here, and the valley is right in between, connecting Amasya to Erzincan up to this point. We are good. I'm good. I'm good, thank you. So this region, the Kelkit Valley region, came in front of me when I was studying the expansion of the Halvetiye Sufi order to the west. But when I was studying, I noticed that it wasn't just the Halveti sheikhs, but also there were other poets, scholars traveling along this region. We know that Kabuli was one of them, who was in the court of Shirvan Shah Sultan, who actually traveled through Kelkit Valley and met the Prince Bayezid in Amasya and then moved to Istanbul. Hamidi, his friend, was one of them. But let's actually focus on the stories of the Halvetis. So the earliest Halveti presence in Anatolia is taken back to the life and deeds of Pir İlyas, which was in fact presented in a fascinating presentation earlier today in Evliya Çelebi's account. Pir İlyas had to take this trip through Kelkit Valley all the way to Şamaxı to meet with his master Sadreddin Hıyavi, not voluntarily, because he was taken by Timur during that time when Timur was, in Anatolia, and then he was taking scholars and Sufis, important dignitaries, with his army back to Samarkand. And along the way, he actually took Pir İlyas, an important scholar in the city of Amasya, and he made him a judge in the city of Şamaxı, where he met Sadreddin Hıyavi, an important Sufi and Halveti leader. And Pir İlyas came back in 1405 after the death of Timur, and during his travels, he of course passed through the Kelkit Valley. Again, we always need to keep in mind that these travels people are taking towards the Kelkit Valley is for a reason. In the absence of modern transportation technologies, people need safe stops where they can spend the night. These manazil are very important, and always risky is the travel through the sea. So the safest place connecting northern Anatolia, cities of Tokat, Sivas, is Kelkit Valley. And the presentations today showed us that earlier settlements of Çağırganlys around the Kelkit Valley provided, safe manazil, safe stops for these traveling agents. Unfortunately, we don't have any accounts of their encounters or how they were received, how they were hosted by these, earlier settlers in the Kelkit Valley. So Pir İlyas was the first one of them, but he was not the last. Habibi Karamani is another figure who's from Aksaray, from central Anatolia, who also traveled to Shirvan through this route and came back and ended up in Amasya. before he went on another tour of Anatolia, and he died in Amasya in 1496. The map here shows the travels of Çelebi Halife, otherwise known as Cemali Halveti, the most important figure in the foundation of the Ottoman Halvetiyye. He also first met Halvetiyye in Tokat, a town in Kelkit Valley, and later on decided to go to Baku, which is marked with a star in the map. But on the way, he learns that Seyyid Yahya, legendary Halveti leader, died, so he actually stops in Erzincan, the eastern end of Kelkit Valley, and there he receives his education and comes back in Amasya. So we see these travels taking place during this period, but later on when I was working on the city of Amasya, I came across other Shirvanis, for example, Ismaili Shirvani, a Naqshbandi Sufi, who also came from Shirvan and settled in Amasya. So I started to think about how this region, these two sub-regions, one in Anatolia, the other in southern Caucasia, were related to each other. And what can that tell us about these historical developed continuities in the longue durée, in the sense of Ferdinand Brodel. And during this time, I started to think about the concept of spatial agency. Could these regions, could these cities can be a historical agent, like the sultans, like the Sufis, or other historical, like the humans we study? Can we come up with non-anthropocentric, basically meaning that explanations that don't put humans in center, but non-humans in center? This idea came to my mind, of course, after the COVID pandemic. We all know that this little virus changed the whole world forever. We know that these viruses had done it before. So non-human actors, non-human agents are very important, and I started to think about how Amasya or this region can be an agent. While I was doing it, Paul Stock's article came out, and the article basically offers spatial agency as the emplacement of effective elements, the gathering of agencies at a particular site and moment, and that kind of explained all of them in my mind. When we talk about Amasya or Kelkit Valley, a particular moment in history witnessed assemblage of agentic actors, important figures, ending up in a smaller place, which actually creates a lot of interaction between them, and then eventually that region becomes very significant in shaping history. Of course, this theory needs to be tested with more research. So wrapping up, what does this, how does this help us to revisit, understand Anatolia? Why am I focused or obsessed with these cities or regions, sub-regions like Shirvan, like Kelkit Valley or Amasya? Well, one outcome, one benefit of looking at these sub-regions of Anatolia helps us question the Istanbul Saray-centered perspectives when we look at Anatolia. Anatolia is always Tashra, always actually a passive element in the story of a rise of a magnificent empire in Istanbul. But these stories of spatial agency, stories of actually how these little or large spaces become historical agents, perhaps can help us to question the centrality of Ottoman narratives, or the obsession of Ottoman narratives with Istanbul. So, and brings Anatolia as a historical agent, an important factor in history. The second point, actually, looking at these regions, was questioning the Turkish national historiography, which present Anatolia more monolithic, yekpare, culturally, more monolithic than it actually is. We know that Anatolia as a region has never been that unified, right? There is always regions, sub-regions. And I'm not talking about the Sunni-Alevi divide or other religious divides. The people from Tokat, Amasya region may have a completely different worldview, compared to the people from Antalya and Tekke region. Or same goes with, Bursa people versus the people in Mersin. So I'm not trying to, of course, I'm not trying to make bölücülük here, but in order to understand Anatolia better and make Anatolia and give some meaning, I'm referring to İhsan Hoca''s earlier talk, give meaning to this land, I think we need to know it better and question some of these nationalist premises. And of course, let's not forget that we are actually, we lived through this, trauma of foreign invasions and the risk of losing Anatolia. So we hope that Anatolia is united, but actually it is not. And the third one is actually a more recent conception of Anatolia, a region that has value only being as a contact zone or a bridge between East and the West. I mean, those of you who can read, this resolution is really bad, sorry for it, but this beautiful poem, which actually is from a book that inspired my own work, is actually the book of Cemal Kafalar, Between Two Worlds, which was published in 1999, and it is actually one of the first pages. It's a poem taken from Hacı Bayram Veli. Calab'ın bir şair yaratmış, and iki cihan arasında. And Cemal Hoca actually, basically opened up a new venues for all of us, for all researchers. But the age he was writing this book was the age when the Turkey was trying to, unite with the, join the European Union, presenting itself as this new Turkey, as a bridge, cultural bridge between East and the West. But that was 25 years ago. I think Turkey, Anatolia, has more value than being a bridge, being a contact zone, or being a place where the cultures meet. Turkey has more endemic cultural values, and Çağırganlığı is actually one of these, terms we can use, or the other terms we can continue, bringing into our vocabulary to create or reconceptualize an Anatolia that has a value of its own, not just a place where East and the West meet. Thank you for listening. Unfortunately, we will not take questions at this moment. We will move on with presentations, and then we'll take questions at the end of the last presentation. I'm going to pass the mic now. Professor Rosana Ratkovc, she'll be giving us a presentation about waves of spiritual migration from Khorasan to Turkestan to Anatolia.
Thank you, my colleague, for announcement. But I have to say that we have this presentation together, my colleague Meliha, Teparic, and me, and that the subtitle of our presentation is Sheikh Hussein Baba Zukic and the legacy of Khorasani Sufism in Naqshbandi culture in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, for the beginning, we both would sincerely like to greet you and express our gratitude to the organizers for the invitation. And it is an honor for us to participate in this conference and to share our research with you. This presentation introduces the 18th century Bosnian Naqshbandi Sheikh Hussein Baba Zukic as a case study for transmission of spiritual authority across the vast geographical distances. Through his life, the discussion analyzes the enduring connection between Khorasan, Turkestan, and Bosnia, mediated through Anatolia. The study explores the 32-long journey from Bosnia to Istanbul, Konya, Samarkand, and Bukhara as both geographical and spiritual experience. Additionally, it examines how this journey shaped his impact in preserving Naqshbandi culture in Bosnia and how his legacy continued to be reflected in contemporary Sufi practices. The Naqshbandi order continues the tradition of the Kharajan masters, the successor of Abdul Halik Gjavani, originating in Khorasan in the 12th century and later reached Bukhara. The Khorasani school is characterized by its emphasis on the practical, ethical, and social aspects of Sufism. In Bukhara, the Naqshbandi order evolved from Muhammad Bahauddin fusion of regional Sufi culture and Medrese scholarship. Muhammad Bahauddin Naqshbandi, died 1489, is now considered the founder of the order. His mausoleum is located in Qasr Arifan near Bukhara. The Naqshbandi order played a significant role in the Islamization of Anatolia and the Balkans, including Bosnia. In Bosnia, the Naqshbandi order appeared in the 15th century and spread particularly strongly in 18th and 19th centuries. It survived through 20th century with renewed expansion in 21st century. The oldest traces of Khorasani presence in Bosnia can be found in the time of Ottoman arrival with the army and administration of Sultan Mehmed Fatih. The graves of his associates are scattered across Bosnia and represent some of the oldest sites of Ziyara. There are turbas of Ghazis, also known as Khorasani turbas. 4 of these are known to us, and all of them date back to the middle of the 15th century. One of these tombs, near Travnik town, is attributed to Sheikh Ibrahim Dede Khorasani, the soldier in the army of Sultan Mehmed Fatih. His tomb became a well-known place of ziyara, particularly visited by women. The second Khorasani turba belongs to dervish known as Sheikh Hussein, a sheikh who served as an advisor on religious affairs to Sultan Mehmed and is said to have been a scribe of the Ahtnama. He is buried in the village of Oglavak near Fornica. 2 more such turbas are known. One is that of Ghazi Sheikh Malkoch Feruh from Persia, situated near Visoko town. There is also the turba in Divic near Zvornik, which is believed to belong to Emir Ahmed and Emir Ali, also the soldiers in the army of Sultan Mehmed Fatih. According to preserved tradition, sheikhs and dervishes from Bukhara, Khiva, Samarkand, Tashkent, Tehran, Konya, and other centers have made pilgrimages to their tomb. Next, please. Later, in the 18th century, we encounter local Bosnian sheikh Hussein Baba Zukic. He was born in the early 1700s in the village of Vukelići in central Bosnia. Hussein Baba grew up in Helveti family. His family lineage is said to trace back to the arrival of Sultan Mehmed when a Melami sheikh named Daniel came from Aleppo and became the earliest known ancestor of Hussein Baba's family. Next, please. After his early education in Bosnia, Hussein Baba continued his studies in Istanbul. There he was initiated into the Naqshbandi order by Mehmed Hafiz Hisari, the sheikh of the Muhammediyye Tekke. This Tekke was named after Murad-i Bukhari, a sheikh originally from Bukhara. He has studied in India under the son of Ahmed Sirindi, founder of the Mujadidi branch of Naqshbandi order. Through this lineage, Hussein Baba's spiritual path was linked with the Mujadidi branch, connecting the tradition of Central Asia and India with the future extension in Bosnia. According to oral tradition, Hussein Baba spent 12 years with Sheikh Muhammad Hisari. Sheikh Hisari, having recognized that Hussein Baba Zukic has big spiritual potential, granted him Khilafetnama for the Naqshbandi order and instructed him to continue his inner journey, one that had to be mirrored by further outward travels with sheikhs in Konya and Bukhara. In Konya, Hussein Baba spent 3 years in the Mevlana Rumi Tekke before proceeding to Transoxania, where he stayed several months in the Naqshbandi Khanqa in Samarkand. After that, he went to Kasri Arifan near Bukhara, where he spent 7 years in the Khanqa attached to the tomb of Bahauddin Naqshband. The time spent at Kasri Arifan marked the climax of Sheikh Hussein Baba's personal inner journey, and at the end of 7 years he set out again for Bosnia, traveling via Iran, Baghdad, Konya and Istanbul. And the Muhammediyye Tekke, like other Uzbek tekkes in Istanbul, functioned as an important hub for travelers from Central Asia. Hussein Baba's case shows a reverse trajectory. He was sent to Transoxania from Istanbul to deepen his knowledge and then spread it in the distant regions of the Ottoman Empire, with Bosnia as its westernmost frontier.
After traveling and spiritual development that lasted 40 years, Sheikh Hussein Baba Zukic returned to Bosnia. In Vukelići, his birthplace, in 1780, he built a mosque and tekke which will become a sitane, central tekke, Naqshbandi tekke, in Bosnia. Sheikh Hussein Baba died in 1800s. In Bosnia, Sheikh Hussein Baba Zukic is significant as the Pir Sani, the second spiritual master. Today, his silsila is known as Husseini branch of Naqshbandi order. The Naqshbandi silsila, it is also unique because it traces its authority to two parallel lines. One through Abu Bakr al-Siddiq and another through Ali ibn Abi Talib and the descendants of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In Husseini branch, Zikr Hafi, which is traditionally practiced in the Naqshbandi order, is combined with Zikr Jahri. This vocal form of zikr was received by Hussein Baba from his Sheikh Muhammad Hisari in Istanbul, who also practiced both Hafi and Jahri zikr at Muhammediyye Tekke. Hussein Baba considered that this combined form of zikr better suited the culture of Bosnian Sufism, and it has been continuously practiced to this day in most Naqshbandi tekkes through Bosnia and Herzegovina. From the historical perspective, Hussein Baba emerged almost near the end of the Ottoman rule in Bosnia, at a time when the political situation was dramatically shifting, with war looming between Ottoman Empire and Austro-Hungary. Given the profound change in Bosnia, with the introduction of Western culture under Austro-Hungarian rule, Hussein Baba played a key role in ensuring the survival of Sufism. This is especially evident considering that the place where he found his tekke, Vukelici, is the only location in Bosnia where the Naqshbandi order persisted continuously from its establishment. As Pirisani, Sheikh Hussein Baba, through his work and influence, established a significant spiritual legacy. This was continued by his murid, Bosnian Sheikh Abdurrahman Siri Baba in Oglavac, and later Siri Baba's disciple Sheikh Muhammad Meli Baba, originally from eastern Anatolia, who continued significantly to spread of Naqshbandi branch, Husseini branch of Naqshbandi Tariqa in Bosnia. This transmission continued further with Sheikh Arif Sidki from Bayburt, who studied under Meli Baba. For a period, Sheikh Arif Sidki led the tekke in Vukelici, later transferring its leadership to Sheikh Hasan Baba, Haji Meli Zade, until his migration to Istanbul, which happened in 1881. Sheikh Arif Sidki was the most prominent figure of Naqshbandi Tariqa in Bosnia and Herzegovina. From the nishan of Sheikh Arif Sidki, who was buried in the courtyard of Muhammediyye Tekke, we learned that in Istanbul he led the Küçük Piyale Tekke in the Kasim Pasha district. As a Naqshbandi Sheikh of Husseini branch, it is highly probable that he spread this particular Naqshbandi lineage. Further research is needed to determine whether Sheikh Arif Sidki appointed any of his disciples as a sheikhs, which would help contextualize Husseini branch in an international framework beyond Bosnia. The Vukelici Tekke its successors and descendants continue to lead tekkes in those regions to this day. The legacy is kept alive through the work of the sheikh from the Haji Melic family and is also present in the Tekke Mesudiyye and Koçuni, established in the late 20th century by Sheikh Mesud Haji Melic. This tekke serves also as an asitane, a central spiritual hub through which this Naqshbandi silsila is expanded to several new locations, continuing the connect followers through its spiritual chain. This presentation has demonstrated that the root of Khorasan tradition have been present since the earliest beginning of Sufism in Bosnia. Therefore, the importance of Hussein Baba carries deeper implication. He was a link between Khorasan, Central Asia, and western borders of Ottoman Empire. Today, the Husseini branch of the Naqshbandi Tariqa is almost widespread in Bosnia and Herzegovina, continuing a tradition that has connected Khorasan and Bosnia for centuries. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. And I would like to thank all of the organizers for this really well-conceived conference. And also, I'm really proud to be participating in this conference in respect to this tradition that is here represented. So what I'm going to talk about is the Yazıcıoğlu brothers of the 15th century Ottoman frontier, and I'm just going to read from my remarks here on this computer. Well, the traditions of Ottoman Sufism find their value because of their claim to universal truth, and their practice and execution depended upon the integration of local ways of living, that is, upon the total history of Anatolia and Rumelia. Perhaps the most important aspect of the integration of Sufism into Anatolia and Rumelia was the translation of Sufi writings and the integration of Sufi writings into the Turkish language, and the composition of new original works in the developing idiom of Anatolian Turkish. In the early 15th century, Tasawwuf literature was still in an early stage of development in Anatolia. Aside from a handful of very enduring bodies of poetry like Yunus Emre or Aşık Pasha, systematic narrative and didactic work was still not extensive. Turkish Sufi literature awaited the composition of its popular classics, the writings that would help create what we see so clearly by the 16th century, a broadly shared Ottoman Turkish Sufi culture with a vibrant popular and not solely elite dimension. The Yazıcıoğlu brothers of 15th century Gelibolu were to provide the first of these classics. To an Ottoman of the 17th and 18th centuries, there was, after the Quran itself, arguably no book as widely read as Mehmed Yazıcıoğlu's 1449 devotional poem, the Muhammediyye. Evliya Çelebi tells of Muhammediyye reciters who sung the poem to audiences throughout Anatolia and Rumelia. The work's autograph, kept where it was written in Gelibolu, was considered to be worthy of visitation. Mehmed Yazıcıoğlu's younger brother Ahmet Bijan too gained a reputation, since his Envaru'l-A, a Turkish prose rendition of the same basic text, was also potent in the popular imagination. It was read and memorized, according to Evliya, in primary schools across Anatolia. In the 17th century, it was studied by Muslims in Hungary, and by the 20th century read as far as Kazan and Kashgar. Both brothers, disciples of Hacı Bayram Veli in Ankara and formerly educated in Edirne during the reign of Murat II, produced what would become a kind of international codification of populist Ottoman Sunnism, of which Tasawwuf was, of course, a central part. The two works under consideration here, Muhammediyye and the Envaru'l-A, were among Turcophone Muslims ubiquitous and universal. They were read and recited in educational contexts, but were also studied in the context of the practice of mysticism. In other words, they were studied as works that contained some element of Irfan within them. So what I would like to focus on are these two dimensions: the question of how a discursive, Medrese-originated intellectual knowledge was integrated into these writings, and secondly, how in addition to this, other forms of knowledge, or spiritual knowledge, let's say, were communicated through them in ritual or non-discursive ways, between Medrese and Tekke, that is, and also how this relates to the frontier. So what is the relationship between these texts as Medrese texts, as frontier texts, as texts composed on a borderland region where people were converting into Islam, and as texts that were used in Tekke context? So with regard to the first category of knowledge, the Yazıcıoğlu brothers show a concern for systematicity. While the Muhammediyye is indeed a narrative describing creation, the various prophets from Adam to Jesus, and the life of Muhammad, it condenses within it a remarkable amount of information on law, prophetic traditions, and Sufi lore. The Envaru'l-A is likewise comprehensive in this regard. Ahmet Bijan describes how he and his brother worked together to write their masterpieces. And here he quotes, my brother Mehmed said, "O Ahmet Bijan, obeying your suggestion, I collected all of the world's laws and truths in one place. In compliance with these words, I completed this book called the Envaru'l-A in Gelibolu, the finest of towns, the abode of jihad. Now Envaru'l-A and my brother's book of verse called the Muhammediyye emanate from this. That book is in verse, and this book is in prose, and they were written in two ways. One was versified so that it may be sweet, and the other was written in prose so that it may be understood. And both styles are fine styles. It is as if the ocean boiled up and overflowed on both sides and made visible whatever kinds of pearls they may be." So we see that the Yazıcıoğlu's texts emerge from a certain environment to try to present truth in alternate ways, as either a sort of memorizable prose, verse way, or as a systematic prose way. The Yazıcıoğlu's texts, however, are generally precise also about the sources of their information. Where they are not explicit, a source can usually be deduced. They were taught by a few scholars who we know the names of. Haydar Heravi, who is to become Sheikhul Islam in Edirne, Dervish Bayezid, a local teacher, and several other features. The materials they drew from were by and large written elsewhere. One class of sources were Hanafi legal texts passed to the Yazıcıoğlu's in the Medreses of Edirne, likely through these migrant scholars I just mentioned. In particular, they relied upon al-Zamakhshari, with a smaller contribution from Shafi'i scholars like al-Baghawi. They were strongly indebted to Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who they quote extensively. A second class of sources were compendia of sacred narrative, of Qasas al-Anbiya, of which they used the exemplars from al-Kisai. They also drew heavily from Süleyman Çelebi's Mevlud, from the Mukaddime of Kutb-ed-Din Izniki, from Mustafa Adarir's Siyar al-Nabi, various other well-known texts that were available at the moment. Finally, they were rather well versed, of course, in the corpus of Ibn Arabi and his chief commentaries, and likely studied this with Hacı Bayram himself. Dozens of other sources formed part of their education, and from these they distilled a basic Hanafi theology. The purposes of this knowledge are varied. The reader or listener was, of course, expected to remember and learn it. What this process of interiorization may have accomplished depends, of course, on who we are talking about. I argue, first of all, that one of its primary audiences were new Muslims, those whose Islam was not rooted in multiple generations of Islamic education. Ahmed Bijan states this clearly in his introduction to Envaru'l-A. These books were written so that people of this land may make use of knowledge and may become knowledgeable and wise, and so that they hold law and truth in their hearts and know the bond of Islam and obtain wisdom. This signaled that the locality, the region itself, was important to the author, and that the writings were designed for this local setting. While their intellectual inheritance was as wide as the Islamic world, their writings were motivated by the particular needs of the Muslims of the Marmara region. So what were these needs? I'm going to skip over this actually a bit, but I hypothesized that a unique demand for these Muslims was to clearly distinguish the essential features of Islam, and particularly to delineate the line between Islam and between Muslims and Christians. Those who know the period will know that there were many moments of sort of interconfessional disputation that characterized the 15th century and late 14th century Ottoman borderlands. And in this context, the phrase that we see here, "our people of this land," that the Yazıcıoğlu's wrote for the people of this land, we can read this in a certain way, that they are attempting to define and delineate who this Islamic ummah actually in this region is. It was both the audience of the writings and its object. Accordingly, the text contains extensive information on the basic narratives of Islam, the stories of creation, the prophets, the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and the last day. It is also explained in detail that the virtues of being a Muslim, the meaning of tawhid, the accumulation of sevab, the value of prayer, of fasting, and of martyrdom. The Muhammediyye and Envaru were in this sense like textbooks for use in a mekteb, and indeed Evliya Çelebi remarks that later on these texts were used in exactly this setting centuries later for this purpose. They offered Muslims a clear vision of what their own faith should mean and require. Okay, so however, the Yazıcıoğlu's or the Envaru'l-A and Muhammediyye were for their audience clearly much more than this, however, and this is what I want to dwell on. Their readers for centuries after imagined that the authors, the Yazıcıoğlu brothers, composed their works in a uniquely inspired way, that they did more than simply compile conventional sources, as I mentioned above, and that they aimed to do something much more profound and hidden than produce a primer for frontier Muslims. According to Evliya Çelebi, for example, Ahmed Bijan used only 3 mythical and occult tomes to compose his work. The Kitab-i Jifr Jami from Abdurrahman Bistami, the Wisdom of Ali, and the Jafar of Muhyiddin ibn Arabi's Fusus, and these signs and secrets were revealed as the book Envaru'l-A. The 17th century commentator, who may be familiar to many of you here, Ismail Haki Bursavi, says that Mehmed dismissed himself from the people and performed self-discipline in his own cell in Gelibolu at the seaside, and that in this state of complete isolation composed the Muhammediyye. And throughout the hagiographical tradition and the biographical dictionary tradition, we see people attribute to these writers unique sources, a sort of secret capacity for wisdom and knowledge. So the question that then arises is, how did this impression arise? If we want to understand the sacrality of these writings, and these writings were truly sacred and are still treated as such, then we must first remember that Ahmed Bijan and Mehmed Yazıcıoğlu were considered by their audience to be Sufi sheikhs. Their community that they founded would endure for at least 2 centuries, since Evliya Çelebi remarks that there was a Tekke existing in Gelibolu up to his time, claiming descent from this tradition. As any student of Tasawwuf knows, the writings and speeches of a sheikh are believed to have instructive qualities extending beyond their mere informational content. We see this in the way that the Muhammediyye's manuscript was treated as sacred, as a sacred object, the palpable air of sacrality that diffuses throughout the entries of the Yazıcıoğlu's in various biographical dictionaries, and so on and so forth. It seems to have been viewed that the contemporaries and later Ottomans viewed these books as not only containing knowledge, but containing a transformative power, as a capacity for marifet, for gnosis. So what is the relationship between knowledge and gnosis? The Sufi lineage of the Yazıcıoğlu brothers proceeds from their own sheikh, Hacı Bayram Veli of Ankara, and from his teacher Somuncu Baba, and back through the lineage of Safiyeddin Ardabili. As such, it is a cousin of the widespread Halvetiye that we've been seeing today a few times already, and draws, of course, from the Fusus al-Hikam and Ibn Arabi tradition as a whole. Now, in Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam, the Sheikh al-Akbar describes receiving the content of that text in an inspired dream from the hand of the Prophet himself. Subsequently, Muayyiduddin Jandi, one of the most important commentators of the Fusus, describes a similar but derivative process. He saw Ibn Arabi impart to him the meanings of the Fusus in a dream. Finally, Ahmed Bijan, writing the Muntaha in the 15th century, this is a later work of his, describes a dream of a stranger who held a book in his hand, and this book was actually a commentary on Jandi's Sharh Fusus. It is from this dreamed commentary that Ahmed Bijan gets his insight. Thus we see knowledge in the form of a book moving across the generations along this secret channel of dreams. Ahmed Bijan later in the work describes the qualities of this form of knowledge. It is a foretaste of ejlav, of the divine glory. A sign of this is God's own word. After this is the word of the Prophet, then the word of Ali, then the word of the muhakkiklar, whose perfections of knowledge are trusted by scholars of the East and the West. In other words, the knowledge contained in the Fusus and its commentaries exists on a continuum with the sorts of sacred knowledge expressed in the words of Ali, the words of the Prophet, and the words of God in the Quran. This seems to be the view through which the sacrality of the Muhammadiyya operates. So then, how was it used? In this, in the Tekke, the kind of knowledge that was incorporated was generally through what we might call traditional Sufi practices, what Sufis call the level of tariqah. And the Yazıcıoğlus elaborate upon what this is in particular. We see them exalt typical practices, tefekkur, tezekkur, tevbe, ittisam, firar, riyazet, sema, and so on and so forth. It's a community that is generally structured by method, and the ancestry and origins of this set of methodologies is something I don't have time to discuss now, but there's nothing very out of the ordinary in it. from the perspective of Ottoman Tasawwuf. However, there's one last thing I'd like to mention here to introduce one further consideration into the relationship between text, between language, and marifa that I've been trying to discuss a bit. We find a passage in a section of the Yazıcıoğlu's in which they are generally recapitulating or quoting Abdurrazak Kashani's Istilahat Sufiya. And I'm not going to read this out in detail, but what Ahmed Bijan says is that there are two types of sheikhs. One are called the Easterners, the Masharika, and the other are called the Westerners, the Meghariba. And the Easterners say asceticism and seclusion are necessary for all students until souls are rescued from the world of darkness. But the Westerners say there is no doubt that asceticism and seclusion, meaning halvet, have their effects, but those who know our system do not have much need for asceticism and seclusion. Asceticism does not necessarily provide provide arrival at their aims, whereas wisdom may be achieved in a year or a month or a week in a day for those students who have the right understanding. So Ahmed Bijan emphasizes this and seems to be saying that from a certain point of view, which he calls a Western point of view, I think connecting it with the Ibn Arabi tradition, an especially talented student can reach gnosis in a single moment of illumination with no need for rigorous self-denying practices, specifically through the integration of sacred, through the contemplation of text, of poetry, and of terminology. So in this sense, we may arrive at a deeper understanding of how the Muhammediyya was used in a Tekke context. It was used to kind of propel and supplement other ascetic practices. So there are many anecdotes that sort of confirm how in later centuries these texts were used with this in mind. There's what I plan to close with, if I have any more time at all, 1 minute, okay, are some couplets composed by a 19th century female Sufi named Sheref Hanım upon visiting Yazıcıoğlu Mehmed's tomb in Gelibolu. Come, O mystics, read this work and open its pages, then you shall understand how much Yazıcızade is a fire-scattering mystic. O eloquent speakers cannot compose a parallel to even a single line of his discourse. Yazıcıoğlu is of miraculous expression. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your patience and attention during this final talk of the day. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers. It is my great honor to be here, especially in memory of Qasim Baba, and it is a great pleasure to be able to present this to esteemed professors and colleagues today. Physiognomy, ilmi firaset, is made up of two parts. One part is firaseti hikmiye, which may be translated as scientific physiognomy. The other part is firaseti shari'a, which essentially means divinely inspired physiognomy. Scientific physiognomy, as the name implies, is an esoteric science which can be studied and, given the requisite proclivities, learned by anyone. Divinely inspired physiognomy, that is firaseti shari'a, is a divine gift which is solely reliant on divine grace. Nothing within the realm of human possibility can guarantee mastery of divinely inspired physiognomy. Although the two seem to have little in common except for a shared name, firaset, this presentation will make the argument that in fact there's a very close tie between the two parts of physiognomy. According to Al-Ghazali, the goal of man's existence is the attainment of divine grace, of which the divine physiognomy is a manifestation. There are four general factors which determine the possibility and degree of human spiritual enlightenment. One is inborn disposition, two is upbringing, three is self-discipline, and finally God's grace. Neither the first two nor the fourth factor are in fact within man's own control. A human is only capable of controlling the third, self-discipline. In order to begin the process of self-discipline, however, clear and detailed knowledge of inborn disposition is an absolute prerequisite. Otherwise, it would be impossible to know precisely which aspects need to be disciplined and which need to be encouraged. Scientific physiognomy, ilmi firaseti hikmiye, is by definition the acquisition of knowledge of one's inborn disposition, that is, inference of inborn dispositions, khulq, based on outward form, khalq. Thus, scientific physiognomy becomes a method for the attainment of divinely inspired physiognomy. In order to understand precisely how physiognomy can lead a person onto the path of self-knowledge through physiognomy of the self, the exact mechanics of the science must be examined. To begin with, Islamic physiognomy is divided into two parts, qism. These are, as mentioned, scientific and inspired physiognomy. Scientific physiognomy is a science that is learned and mastered through study and experience. It essentially consists, as is up here, inferring a person's inner character with balanced intelligence and measured physiognomy by means of their outward state. According to Taşköprüzade, it is acquired through experience, tajruba, because experience demonstrates that some external cases indicate internal moral dispositions. Balizade Mustafa, in his Firasetname, further explains that through judicial and decisive observation, it is possible to perfect this type of physiognomy through a combination of practice and instruction, ta'lim ve tafhim. On the one hand, in study and learning of books and treatises on the other. End quote. Because this is the type of physiognomy that can be mastered through the study of treatises, Balizade Mustafa adds that his own treatise was composed precisely for the teaching of scientific physiognomy. The second part of physiognomy is divinely inspired, firasat-i-sharia. Unlike scientific physiognomy, firasat-i-sharia is not attainable through human effort. It does not have the same scientific basis with a predictable set of protasis and apodosis which can be discerned. Hence, it cannot be studied nor learned. It is simply a divine gift. Balizade Mustafa's Firasetname gives the following definition up here, which basically, I will skip reading it to save time, but you can read it for yourself as I go on. According to this particular description, divinely inspired physiognomy, Firasat-i-Sharia, is essentially presented as a characteristic of God's prophets and saints, those who have attained perfection. All the definitions of the science of physiognomy stress that the defining difference between the two is the fact that, given the necessary skill, Firasat-i-Hikmiya can be acquired through human effort, while Firasat-i-Sharia is strictly a divine gift to those whom God has favored. Now, in the Ottoman tradition, particularly in the Şemail-name, composed by Lokman Çelebi for Murat III in 1579, it states on a number of occasions that a diagnosis of bad character traits, tashkhis, is possible through the science of physiognomy. Once exposed, these characteristics can then be transformed through self-discipline and instruction, riyazat wa tadib. Quoting Ibn Sina, the Şemail-name continues, quote, "Those whose natural constitution is equable have an equable nature and thus display equable actions," end quote. Contradictory actions, on the other hand, are the result of an inequable or defective nature. In other words, if man's natural constitution is not equable, mu'tadil, it produces inequable behavior. Thus, in order for man to become a functional and productive member of society, it is necessary first to establish balance within. A temperate and balanced nature is furthermore the necessary stepping stone towards attaining moral and spiritual transformation. A balanced nature was especially expected of the ruling elite, for whom the Şemail-name was composed, because in order to properly enforce justice, every member of the ruling elite needed first to establish justice within themselves, as indicated by the lexicographical connection between Mu'tedil and Adalet. The Şemail-name and other physiognomy treatises propose the science of physiognomy as a way of resolving the problem of an imbalanced soul, which is the cause of imbalanced behavior and thus a block to spiritual enlightenment. Knowledge of the science of physiognomy taught one to discern the first cause of undesired actions and character traits in the very makeup in which a person was created. Only then, based on a very accurate understanding of the precise imbalances in man's natural constitution, could the proper rectification of the root causes of misbehavior begin. The process then becomes riyazet ve tedib. The Şemail-name, which is a physiognomical study of the Ottoman dynasty, written for Sultan Murad and his court, was first and foremost interested in portraying and developing the uses of firaset for the Ottoman Sultan and his court. In essence, however, it too recognized the same two major usages or benefits, faide, for physiognomy. One was self-physiognomation as the first step towards self-discipline. It also added a third benefit, the ability to discern a person's religion, and particularly to expose non-Muslims passing themselves off as Muslims, which can be said to fall within the larger category of applying physiognomy on others. The potential role of physiognomy in the process of acquiring self-knowledge, the first step on the path to self-transformation, appears on numerous occasions in the Şemail-name. Quote, "Thus, with a proper understanding on the basis of this science, negative actions and fortunes can be diagnosed and subsequently transformed through moral self-disciplining and moral instruction." End quote. The three benefits of physiognomy which follow, continues the Şemail-name, will make this amply clear. These are listed in the following order. The first benefit is that with sound knowledge of this ilm, any person's deportment and manners, even their craft and occupation, can be determined in detail. The second benefit is that with knowledge of this science, besides recognizing a person's craft, a non-Muslim deceiver who's passing himself off as a Muslim can be detected and exposed. The third benefit is that through knowledge of this science, the negative parts of one's natural disposition, jibilet, which will become apparent through the science taught by physiognomy, can be removed, and the application of riyazet can begin. End quote. In the Şemail-name, in other words, the Şemail-name encourages the Sultan and his ruling elite to learn this science in order to fulfill the following expectations: the ability to perceive their subject's character, occupation, and religion, and to know themselves so as to initiate a process of self-transformation. It thus becomes clear that physiognomy's potential as a way to self-knowledge is very visibly and deeply interwoven through the whole Şemail-name. In other words, it is a central and recurring theme addressed from numerous perspectives. The Şemail-name is deeply invested in alerting its audience, that is, the Sultan and his court, about the need for moral improvement. As yet another example, this time rendered in verse, the following short poem may be quoted. O you who drink the sherbet of firaset, you who fashion this pearl of wisdom into an earring, know. Self-discipline transforms your being, piety washes lassitude from your nature, wage war upon your nafs, and you will be clean and free from reproach. The meaning of the short poem is straightforward and requires little elucidation. It is, however, necessary to call attention to the terminology which is drawn upon in this poem. The process of transformation, as described in the poem, begins with firaset. Immersion in firaset leads to wisdom, which brings awareness to the need for self-discipline, riyazet of the nafs. The ultimate result of a successful disciplining of the nafs is perfection. Another firaset name from the same period by Taliqizade one of the three texts written for Murat III, makes direct references to this. Without any ambiguity, Taliqizadeh writes that, quote, one of the precious benefits of this noble science is that it leads one to awareness of one's own vices, end quote. Taliqizadeh's identity as courtier shines through even in this scientific text. This is especially evident in the fact that his description of physiognomy of the self is automatically directed at those in power. The treatise, which like many other physiognomy treatises at the time, was openly dedicated to the reigning sultan. His description of the Ottoman court and the general lack of true self-knowledge amongst powerful courtiers is marked by a personal and somewhat frustrated tone. Thus, Taliqizadeh wrote, it was simply impossible to indicate defects and shortcomings to the possessors of noble rank, to those in positions of glory, or to anyone else, end quote. In other words, Taliqizadeh is suggesting a culture of hypocrisy at court, in which everyone was perfectly aware of the high moral standards which were collectively espoused, yet no one examined the degree to which their own moral character fit that standard. So Taliqizadeh continues, quote, until the time when they start improving their moral character through actions and start acquiring different kinds of beautiful characteristics through deeds, they are confined to knowledge without experience or experience without knowledge, end quote. Ultimately, it is of no benefit to point out another's shortcomings. Indeed, it may even be harmful. Rather, the path to moral uprightness demands that every person examine themselves and act accordingly. True perfection, according to Taliqizadeh, lies in the combination of knowledge and action. One without the other will not do. And because I'm running out of time, one more minute, I will conclude with the last passage from Taliqizadeh. Again, the most difficult thing in the process of acquiring ma'rifat is knowing the vices, ma'ayib of one's nafs. By recognizing these vices in one's appearance, the mirror of one's moral character can be cleansed from the rust of defects. Thank you very much.